Hello, everyone. Today, we're delving into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through the lens of the fascinating book State of Terror: How Terrorism Created Modern Israel by Thomas Suarez. Now, I know what you're thinking. Yes, this absolutely is a very sensitive topic, but it's also a topic that demands our attention, our curiosity, and most importantly, our critical thinking. The history of the Israel-Palestine conflict is undeniably fascinating, and as Suarez argues, terrorism played a pivotal role in the creation of one of the key players in this clash of cultures that has lasted nearly a century. But it's not the player you might think. Let's start with the book's central premise. The idea that the ongoing conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is not just a clash of historic enemies, but rather the result of a deliberate, violent campaign by the political movement known as Zionism. According to Suarez, this campaign was driven by a determination to expropriate all of mandatory Palestine for a settler colonial nation comprising only of Jews. Zionists pursued this goal for decades through a combination of political maneuvering, propaganda, and crucially, terrorism. Now, before we go any further, let's define our terms. When we talk about terrorism in this context, we're not just talking about violence against the ruling British establishment, who at the time had total control over Palestine. Suarez argues that Zionist violence targeted anyone who stood in the way of their goal, including British officials, Palestinians, and even other Jews who were not as sympathetic towards the goal of creating a Jewish state. This violence was not sporadic or disorganized. It was systematic and often carried out by well-structured militias, like the Irgun and Lehi, with the tacit and sometimes explicit approval of Zionist organizations like the Jewish Agency for Israel. One of the most chilling aspects of this history is the way in which terrorism was used to achieve political objectives. For example, the infamous Deir Yassin massacre in 1948, where men, women, and children were slaughtered, was not just a horrific act of violence. According to Suarez, it was a calculated move by the Irgun, with the approval of the Haganah, to terrorize Palestinians into fleeing their homes, thereby paving the way for the establishment of a Jewish state. And this wasn't an isolated incident. The book is filled with accounts of bombings, assassinations, and other acts of terror carried out by Zionist militias. These attacks were often justified as defensive measures, but as Suarez points out, the targets were frequently civilians, and the goal was often to provoke a reaction that could then be used to justify further aggression. But it's not just the violence that makes this history so disturbing. It's also the way in which language was manipulated to serve the Zionist cause. Suarez highlights how terms like self-defense and infiltrators were used to reframe the narrative, painting Israelis as victims and Palestinians as aggressors. This linguistic sleight of hand was crucial in shaping international perceptions and securing support for the Zionist project. And let's not forget the role of the British. The book reveals how the British, despite their official mandate to oversee Palestine, often turned a blind eye to violence against Palestinians, fearing the political fallout and the propaganda opportunities it would provide the Zionist movement, particularly in the United States. This complicity, Suarez argues, was a key factor in enabling the Zionist militias to operate with relative impunity. Now, I know this is heavy stuff, but it's important to remember that this is not just a history lesson. The implications of this history are still felt today. The tactics used by Zionist militias during the Mandate period laid the groundwork for the policies and practices of the Israeli state, from the expropriation of Palestinian land to the systemic discrimination faced by non-Jewish citizens. Suarez also delves into the way in which the Holocaust was exploited to further the Zionist cause. He argues that the unimaginable suffering of European Jews was co-opted to justify the creation of a state that, in many ways, mirrored the very fascism they had fled. This is a controversial claim, but it's one that deserves to be examined. So, what can we take away from all of this? First and foremost, we need to recognize that the history of Israel and Palestine is not a simple story of good versus evil. It's a complex, multi-layered narrative filled with shades of gray. We must be willing to question the narratives we've been told and to seek out diverse perspectives. Secondly, we need to acknowledge the role that terrorism has played in shaping the modern state of Israel. This is not to justify or condone violence, but rather to understand the historical context in which it occurred and to recognize its impact on the present. Finally, we need to ask ourselves, what does this mean for the future? If we are to move towards a just and lasting peace in the region, we must confront the uncomfortable truths of the past. We must recognize the humanity of all those involved and work towards a solution that addresses the root causes of the conflict, not just its symptoms. Thank you for joining me on this journey through State of Terror. I hope this episode has sparked your curiosity and encouraged you to think critically about the history of Israel and Palestine. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and share it with your friends. And as always, feel free to reach out with your thoughts and questions. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep shining your light.
This has been a BrightLearn video from BrightLearn.ai on the book State of Terror, How Terrorism Created Modern Israel by Thomas Suarez. Visit BrightLearn.ai for more fascinating videos like this one, and naturalnews.com for full editorial coverage and breaking news on critical stories that keep you informed and aware of what's really going on.